Snow flurried in the brittle Montana wind, swirling about Clara Bennett's boots as she stepped down from the stagecoach. She clutched her worn carpetbag with both hands, the leather handle slick with frost. Behind her, the driver unloaded her single trunk with a thud against the icy platform. A few townsfolk lingered outside the station, collars turned high, eyes narrowing to inspect the newcomer. She had imagined this moment differently. In her mind, Harold would be there, tall and smiling, holding out his hands as though she were the answer to his prayers. They would ride away in a buggy, speaking softly of the home they'd build. But the man who stepped forward now, tall and broad-shouldered, did not smile. His eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned her face in one swift, damning pass. "Miss Bennett?" he asked, voice clipped. "Yes," she said, her breath making a fragile puff in the cold air. Harold looked her over again, and Clara could feel the weight of it. How his gaze lingered on the plainness of her features, the modest cut of her dress, the stubborn wave in her hair that refused to lie flat. His mouth tightened into a line that was not quite a frown, but it was no welcome either. "This," he gestured vaguely at her, "is not what I was expecting." Clara's fingers gripped the handle of her bag, so hard the skin whitened. "I came as your letters invited me to," she said quietly. The crowd had already begun to murmur. An older woman in a fur-lined shawl leaned toward a friend and whispered something that made them both smirk. Harold cleared his throat, his voice loud enough to carry. "I won't be marrying you, Miss Bennett. I think it's best you return east." The words were so final, so public, that Clara's breath caught in her chest. She could feel heat rising in her cheeks despite the cold, an ache of humiliation that pressed against her ribs. She swallowed hard, willing herself not to cry. "Not here, not before these strangers. I came all this way," she said, her voice trembling despite her resolve. "I left everything." "That's not my concern," Harold interrupted, already stepping back. "You misrepresented yourself. I was expecting someone else." The crowd chuckled under their breath, the sound like the snapping of brittle twigs. Clara turned her head slightly, wishing she could vanish into the falling snow. And then a voice, low, steady, cut through the muttering. "That's no way to speak to a lady." A man stepped forward from the edge of the platform. His coat was thick with trail dust, his hat pulled low against the wind. He had the look of someone accustomed to the land, broad hands, weather-lined skin, eyes the color of storm clouds. "Samuel Hayes," he said, touching his brim politely to Clara before fixing Harold with a look that was calm but unyielding. "If you've no intention of honoring your word, best let the lady keep her dignity." Harold snorted, unwilling to be shamed. "She'll be fine. There's a train east in 2 days." Samuel's gaze flicked to Clara. She was standing very still, shoulders drawn in, as if trying to make herself smaller against the sting of rejection. Something in that sight seemed to settle his decision. "Ma'am," he said gently, "there's an inn down the street. Warm fire, decent stew. I'll see you there if you've a mind." For a moment, Clara hesitated. Pride warred with desperation, but her feet were numb, and the thought of sitting alone in the station for 2 days, while the town whispered about her, was unbearable. She gave a small nod. Samuel lifted her trunk easily, as if it weighed nothing, and gestured for her to walk with him. They left the station behind, though she could still feel the sting of eyes on her back. The inn was modest but clean, with the scent of wood smoke and simmering meat drifting from the kitchen. Samuel set her trunk by the hearth and ordered 2 bowls of stew from the innkeeper without asking if she was hungry. She was. She hadn't eaten since dawn, and the warmth of the broth was like life returning to her veins. "You don't owe me thanks," Samuel said after a while, breaking a piece of bread. "But I saw no reason for that man to speak to you the way he did." Clara looked into her bowl, unwilling to meet his eyes just yet. "It's not the first time I've been found wanting." The admission was quiet, but she knew he heard it. He didn't answer immediately, only regarded her with a kind of thoughtful patience. "What brings you to this country, Miss Bennett?" She hesitated, then told him about the small room she'd rented back east, the seamstress work that barely kept her fed, the letters from Harold promising a home and a life where she might be useful. "Useful," Samuel repeated, as if testing the word. That's a poor reason for a man to send for a wife. She gave a short, humorless laugh. Perhaps, but it was more than I had. He leaned back in his chair, the firelight throwing warm shadows across his face. I've a ranch about a day's ride from here. Got a girl, 8 years old, who needs someone to mind her while I tend to work. Been hard on her since her ma passed. Clara looked up, startled. You're asking me? I'm asking if you'd like a roof over your head, work worth doing, and a place where no one will turn you away at the door. His tone was plain, without the flourish of courtship, but there was a steadiness in it that felt almost like safety. She studied him, this man who had stepped out of the cold to defend a stranger. There was no pity in his eyes, only a quiet assessment, as if he were weighing her the way one might judge a horse for strength and endurance. Oddly, she didn't mind. I don't know you, she said finally. You will, he replied, and I'll not force you to stay if you decide otherwise. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the pop of the hearth. Clara thought of the station, of Harold's cold dismissal, of the long journey east to nothing. She thought of an 8-year-old girl who had lost her mother. All right, she said softly. Samuel nodded once, the decision sealed without fanfare. We'll leave in the morning. Clara finished her stew, feeling the warmth spread deeper than the food. For the first time since stepping off the stagecoach, she felt something unfamiliar, a fragile thread of possibility, tugging her forward. And somewhere in the howling wind outside, the story she thought she'd come here to live had already been replaced by another. The morning broke with a thin veil of mist, the kind that softened the jagged edges of the Montana hills. Clara woke early, though the warmth of the inn's quilt made her reluctant to leave it. She dressed quickly in her traveling clothes, knowing Samuel would not wait long. Downstairs, he was already seated at a table near the window, a mug of coffee cradled in his hand. The steam curled upward, catching the light. His hat sat beside him, brim damp from last night's snow. "Morning, Miss Bennet," he said, his voice calm as still water. "Morning, Mr. Hayes," she replied, sitting across from him. They ate in companionable silence, though Clara felt the weight of the decision she had made the night before pressing at her ribs. She knew little about Samuel Hayes beyond what she had seen, a man capable of quiet defense, but also one who measured his words with care. Once the bill was settled, they stepped into the cold. The air was sharp enough to bite, but the sun had begun to burn away the mist. Samuel loaded her trunk onto the back of his wagon, then offered a hand to help her up. She accepted, her gloved fingers brushing the roughness of his palm. The road out of town wound through open stretches of prairie, where the snow lay in long drifts broken only by the dark rise of sagebrush. Samuel handled the reins with ease, guiding the horses steadily forward. "You've worked a ranch before?" he asked after a while. "No," Clara admitted, "but I've worked hard all my life. I learn quickly." He nodded once, as though that was answer enough. Hours passed in a rhythm of creaking wheels and the muffled crunch of hooves. Clara's thoughts drifted to Harold's face at the station, to the sting of rejection, to the strange sense of reprieve sitting beside her now. She did not know what this arrangement with Samuel would become, but at least it was something solid beneath her feet. By late afternoon, clouds had begun to gather on the horizon, heavy and low. Samuel glanced at them and clicked the reins. "Storm coming sooner than I thought. We'll need to make better time." The wind picked up, threading icy fingers through Clara's coat. The horses tossed their heads, uneasy. Snow began to fall, not the soft flakes of yesterday, but sharp, wind-driven bursts that stung her cheeks. They pressed on, the land growing rougher, hills rising against the dimming sky. Clara clung to the side of the wagon as it jolted over frozen ruts. The cold seemed to seep through her bones, until she could no longer feel her toes. At last, through the thickening curtain of snow, she saw it. A cluster of buildings huddled against the slope of a low hill. A barn loomed closest, its roof already layered with white, and beyond it, a 2-story farmhouse, with smoke curling from the chimney. Samuel drove the wagon into the yard and pulled up near the porch. "Inside," he said, jumping down to help her. The door swung open before they reached it, A small girl stood there, her hair the color of burnished wheat, eyes wide with curiosity. She wore a patched dress and thick woolen socks, and the look she gave Clara was not unkind, but cautious, like a stray animal assessing whether to draw near. "This is Anna," Samuel said as they stepped inside. "Anna, this is Miss Bennett. She'll be staying with us for a while." The girl gave a small nod, but said nothing. Clara offered a tentative smile, but Anna had already turned back toward the kitchen. The warmth of the house wrapped around Clara like a quilt. The scent of wood smoke mingled with something savory on the stove. Samuel set her trunk in a corner, then went to remove his coat and boots. "You'll have the room upstairs, second door on the left," he said. "Anna's across the hall. Supper's in an hour." Clara climbed the narrow staircase, her legs aching from the day's ride. The room was small but tidy, with a quilt-covered bed and a single window overlooking the yard. She set her bag down, then stood for a moment, listening to the muffled sounds of movement below. Part of her wanted to sink onto the bed and let exhaustion claim her, but another part, stubborn and wary, knew she could not afford to appear idle on her first night. She washed her hands and face in the basin, then went downstairs to find the kitchen. Anna was setting plates at the table, her motions careful but brisk. Clara stepped forward. "May I help?" The girl hesitated, then handed her a stack of forks. "They go here," she said quietly, pointing to the places she'd set. It was not much, but it was a start. When Samuel joined them, they ate without much talk at first. The stew was thick with potatoes and carrots, and Clara found herself eating more than she had expected. At one point, she glanced up to find Anna watching her with a kind of tentative curiosity, as though trying to decide whether Clara belonged here at all. After the meal, Samuel stood and stretched. "Storm's going to be rough tonight. Best make sure the barn's tight." "I'll help," Clara said before she could think better of it. He looked at her, one brow lifted. "It's cold work." "I can manage." Outside, the wind had risen to a mournful howl, driving snow in swirling gusts. Together, they crossed to the barn, the ground already slippery beneath their boots. Inside, the air was warmer, filled with the scent of hay and horses. Samuel checked the latches and made sure the animals had enough feed and water. Clara held the lantern, her fingers numb even through her gloves. When they stepped back outside, the snow was coming down in heavy sheets. Clara pulled her coat tighter, the wind whipping her hair into her eyes. Halfway to the house, Samuel spoke over the storm. "Most folks wouldn't be out here in this weather if they didn't have to. Most folks didn't cross half the country for a chance to belong somewhere," she replied. He glanced at her then, something unreadable in his expression, but he said nothing more until they were back inside, shaking off the snow. Later, as Clara lay in bed listening to the wind batter the windows, she thought of Anna's guarded gaze, of Samuel's steady presence in the storm, and of the way the house felt both foreign and quietly promising. She did not yet know what her place here would be, but she knew this much: she was not ready to leave. And somewhere deep inside, a resolve began to take root, stubborn as the prairie grass that clung to the frozen earth outside. The storm raged for 2 more days, hemming them in like prisoners of the land. Snow piled high against the barn, wind groaned around the eaves, and the narrow windows filled with the shifting wall of white. Clara soon learned that storms in Montana were not idle things. They were a force that tested every creak in the walls, every gap under the door, and every thread of a person's patience. Samuel spent most of those days in the barn or mending tools in the shed, coming in only for meals. Anna, when not doing small chores, retreated to her corner by the stove with a book or scraps of fabric to stitch. Clara helped where she could, peeling potatoes, washing dishes, sweeping floors, but the silence in the house had weight to it. She tried once to make conversation with Anna while the girl sorted buttons at the table. "Those are lovely," Clara said, picking one up. "Did you save them from an old dress?" Anna didn't look up. "They're Ma's," she said simply. The words hung in the air like frost. Clara set the button down, careful not to let it clink against the tin. It was clear that Ma was a presence still very much alive in memory, if not in body. Clara didn't press. By the 3rd day, The air between them felt too tight to ignore. After breakfast, Clara wrapped herself in her shawl and went outside, needing space even if it meant facing the cold. The yard was nearly unrecognizable under the drifts, but the barn roof stood dark against the sky, a solid shape in the endless white. Inside, Samuel was forking hay into a stall. He looked up when she entered, surprise flickering in his eyes. "Didn't expect you to come out in this." "I needed air," she said, "and I thought maybe I could help." He leaned on the pitchfork. "You don't have to prove anything." "It's not about proving," she said quietly. "It's about being useful." Something in her tone made him study her for a moment, then nod. "All right. Hold the gate while I bring the next bale." The work was heavy, the hay scratchy against her gloves, but she welcomed the ache in her arms. It kept her from thinking too much. When they finished, Samuel brushed the snow from his coat and said, "Anna's been slow to warm to most folks since—" He stopped, as though unsure if he should go on. "Since her mother," Clara supplied gently. He nodded once. "She keeps her distance. I figure she'll come around in her own time." Clara hesitated. "And if she doesn't?" Samuel's jaw tightened. "Then we keep doing right by her anyway." They walked back to the house in silence. That afternoon, Clara found Anna in the kitchen, frowning at a lump of dough. The girl was pressing it with uncertain hands, the rolling pin lying untouched beside her. "Making bread?" Clara asked. Anna gave a small shrug. "Pa says I should learn. I can't get it right." Clara moved closer. "May I show you something? My mother taught me a trick for dough that doesn't want to behave." Anna hesitated, then stepped back. Clara washed her hands, then took the dough and began folding it over itself, pressing with the heel of her palm in a steady rhythm. "See, it's not about fighting it. You press, fold, turn, like you're coaxing it into shape." The girl watched, brow furrowed, then tried it herself. Her movements were awkward at first, but steadier with each turn. Clara smiled. "That's it. You're telling it who's boss, kindly." For the first time, a small laugh escaped Anna. It was quick and quiet, but it warmed the kitchen more than the stove. By the time the loaf went into the oven, there was an easiness between them that hadn't been there before. They sat at the table while it baked, the smell of warm bread filling the room. Anna spoke first. "Pa said you came from far away." "Why?" Clara considered her answer. "Because I wanted a place where I mattered, somewhere I could build something worth keeping." Anna nodded slowly, as though turning the words over. Then, with a seriousness far beyond her years, she asked, "And do you think you'll find it here?" Clara's gaze flicked toward the window, where snow still swirled against the glass. "I think maybe I already have." The bread came out golden and crisp, and when Samuel returned from the barn, they cut it while it was still steaming. He raised his brows at the sight of Anna proudly, setting the loaf on the table. "Looks like you've been busy." "Miss Bennett showed me how," Anna said, a touch of pride in her voice. Samuel met Clara's eyes over the loaf, and for a moment there was something like gratitude there, unspoken but clear. That night, after Anna went to bed, Samuel lingered at the table, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. Clara was drying dishes when he spoke. "She laughed today," he said. Clara glanced at him. She did. "It's been a while," he admitted, his voice low. "Since her ma passed, she's been locked up. You're the first person she's let in, even a little." Clara set the dishcloth down. "I'm not here to replace her mother, but maybe I can be someone she can trust." Samuel studied her for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. "Trust is earned here, but I reckon you're on the right path." Outside, the wind was dying down at last, leaving only the occasional groan of the rafters. Inside, the quiet felt different, less like distance, more like a pause between heartbeats. When Clara went upstairs, she found a small object on her bed, a single mother-of-pearl button. She held it in her palm, the surface cool and smooth, and knew instantly where it had come from. Anna's way of saying "you're welcome here," without saying it at all. Clara tucked it into the pocket of her dress, the smallest of treasures in a place where she had arrived with nothing but a battered trunk and a guarded heart. For the first time since stepping off that train, she began to believe she could stay. Not just because Samuel had offered shelter, but because a young girl with wheat-colored hair had decided to let her in. And though neither of them said it aloud, something had shifted. The walls, at least some of them, were breaking. The thaw came slowly that year, like a stubborn old man reluctant to give up his chair by the fire. Patches of snow lingered in the shadowed gullies, while the pastures turned the color of new wheat. The McAllister ranch should have been breathing easier, yet a quiet tension hung over it like the last clouds before a storm. Clara had begun to feel the rhythm of her days. Mornings filled with coffee and the scrape of Samuel's boots across the porch, afternoons spent teaching Anna her letters, evenings mending shirts by the fire. It was the life of a ranch wife, and though it was harder than anything she'd known before, it was also fuller. But even in the fullness, trouble had a way of finding its way in. Samuel came back from town one late afternoon with his jaw tight and his eyes shadowed. Clara noticed it immediately as he untied his horse, his movements clipped. "What's happened?" she asked once he stepped into the kitchen. He pulled a letter from his coat, creased and damp from the ride. The loan on the herd. It was sold to a new owner, Horace Barlow. He's calling it due early. Says he doesn't trust my management skills. Clara frowned. "Can you pay it?" Samuel shook his head once. "Not without selling half the cattle. And if I do that, we won't make it through next winter." The following morning, Barlow himself arrived in a glossy black carriage, dressed in fine wool and carrying himself with the smugness of a man certain the world owed him obedience. His eyes swept over the ranch, lingering too long on Clara as he stepped forward. "I like to know where my investments stand," he said, shaking Samuel's hand without warmth. "And you're standing on fine land here. I'll take the east pasture in exchange for clearing your debt. You can keep running cattle, but you'll be running them under my terms." Clara knew enough to understand the east pasture wasn't just grass and fence. It was the backbone of the herd, the grazing ground that had kept the McAllisters afloat for years. "No deal," Samuel said. His voice was calm, but there was steel in it. Barlow's smile thinned. "Then you've got 30 days to come up with the full amount." He left in a churn of wheels and dust, but the weight of his presence stayed behind. That night, after Anna had gone upstairs, Clara found Samuel at the table, a half-empty cup of coffee cooling in his hands. "I could sell my sewing machine," she said, "and the brooch my mother left me. It's worth something in town." Samuel's head lifted sharply. "I won't take what you brought here. That's yours." "This is my home now, too," she said steady. "You don't get to decide I can't fight for it." He looked at her for a long moment. "I've carried the weight of this place alone for so long, I forget how to share it." "Then it's time you learned," she said softly. The next day, Clara took Anna into town. They went door to door, dressmaker, baker, boarding house, offering to sew, mend, or alter garments. By sundown, she had enough orders to bring in steady coin for the month. When she told Samuel, he didn't say much, but his hand lingered on her shoulder longer than it needed to. And in that small gesture, she felt the unspoken gratitude. A week later, the sky turned the color of iron, and the wind picked up sharp and cold. A spring storm rolled in fast, splitting the clouds with lightning. Samuel burst into the kitchen, rain dripping from his hat. "Fences down on the east pasture. The herd scattering. I'll need every hand." Without hesitation, Clara pulled on her boots. Anna's eyes widened, but Clara only said, "Keep the fire going. We'll be back." The storm hit like a wall, sheets of rain, mud sucking at their feet, wind tearing at coats. Together they drove the cattle back, the thunder rolling overhead. A steer broke from the group, heading toward a gully swollen with runoff. Clara didn't think. She ran, rope swinging. The lasso caught. The animal jolted to a stop, and she dug in her heels until Samuel reached her side. By the time the last post was set back into place, they were soaked to the bone, breathless under the crack and flash of the storm. Samuel's eyes found hers, rain dripping from his lashes, and for a moment the world shrank to just the two of them, equal in exhaustion, in resolve, in something neither had dared name before. When they trudged back to the house, Anna threw her arms around Clara, clinging tightly. Something in that embrace told Clara the last barrier between them had finally fallen. Over the next 2 weeks, neighbors arrived to help. Men with hammers, women with hot food, children with laughter that lightened the work. Clara's sewing brought in coins. Samuel traded smartly, selling 2 older bulls and a wagon of surplus hay. By the end of the month, they had enough to meet the debt. Barlow returned expecting surrender. Samuel met him on the porch, handing over a pouch of coins and the signed agreement. Barlow's eyes narrowed. "Seems you've had yourself a miracle." Samuel's gaze slid to Clara. "Not a miracle, just someone worth standing with." That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Samuel stood with Clara on the porch. Anna sat on the steps, weaving wildflowers into a chain. "You've done more than I could have asked," Samuel said. "For Anna, for this land, for me." Clara looked out at the mended pasture, glowing gold in the fading light. "I didn't expect to find love here, Samuel, but I think I have." His hand found hers, rough and warm. "Then we'll fight to keep it, together." Anna looked up, smiling in a way that reached her eyes. She placed a flower chain over Clara's wrist like a crown, and as the first stars pricked through the purple sky, Clara knew she hadn't just survived the storms. She had found the home, the family, and the love they had fought for.